when humanity's president declared, "Enough talking, let's start the war." Part 1. The station floated in the dark, between two dying moons, old and cold and gray, like a bone left in space. Its name was the Theta 9 Conclave Platform, and it had hosted more than 400 years of interstellar coalition meetings. Wars had been avoided here. Treaties had been signed here. Civilizations had come to this table and walked away with their futures, shaped by words and ink and polite agreement. Humanity had been coming to this table for 40 years. In that time it had learned one thing very well. Nobody at this table thought much of humanity. President Aaron Cole sat at the far end of the great circular chamber, which was designed to make every seat feel equal, but somehow never did. The Vreth delegates, tall and soft-bodied, moved like slow water as they settled into their places. The Qua'al, angular and crystalline, sat to the left, their surfaces picking up the chamber's cold light and throwing it back in sharp angles. There were 9 other species present, all of them older than humanity by centuries, all of them carrying themselves with the ease of people who had never once needed to prove anything to anyone. Cole was 61 years old. He had the kind of face that had been through weather, not handsome in a polished way, but settled, like stone that had taken its shape a long time ago. He had served as a Marine officer before moving into politics, and he carried both careers in the way he held himself, straight-backed and quiet, with eyes that took things in without giving much back. Beside him sat General Laura Briggs, his Secretary of Defense, who had a short gray braid and the expression of someone perpetually doing math in her head. On his other side was Ambassador Daniel Harrow, a thin and careful man who had spent 30 years in coalition diplomacy, and who believed, with a deep and genuine faith, that every problem had a solution that did not involve shooting. The session had been going for 3 hours. High Consul Orvan, the lead Vreth delegate, old and enormous and slow, had spent most of that time explaining the coalition's new resolution in the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. The Draknari hegemony, a militaristic empire from the outer spiral arm, had been expanding for a decade. They wanted a buffer zone. The coalition had decided that the buffer zone would be the Kepler Belt, a string of human colonies that had existed for 60 years, home to 4 million people who had built their lives on hard rock and recycled air, and the promise that Earth had their backs. The resolution called it a voluntary relocation. It called it a stabilization measure. It called it the rational choice. Orvan finished speaking and folded its soft hands on the table. The room settled into the expectant silence of people waiting for a small creature to agree to something large. Ambassador Harrow opened his folder and uncapped his pen. He had a counter-proposal ready. It was a good one, detailed, diplomatic, designed to give humanity a face-saving delay of perhaps 18 months. He had spent 2 weeks writing it. He never got to present it. Cole reached over quietly and closed Harrow's folder. Harrow looked at him. Laura Briggs looked at him. Orvan blinked its 4 amber eyes and waited. Cole sat still for a moment, very still, in a way that Laura Briggs had learned to recognize. She had seen it once before, in a briefing room on a base in West Africa, when a junior officer had told Cole that the people he had sent into a valley were not coming back. He had gone that same kind of still. Then he had gotten up and fixed the problem himself, with whatever was available. She leaned toward him and said quietly, "Sir." He did not respond right away. He was looking at the table, but not at the table. He was looking at something behind his own eyes. He was counting 40 years. He was thinking about a hydroponics farmer on Kepler 7 who had written him a letter the week before about her daughter starting school. He was thinking about how many times humanity had been asked to give something up in exchange for the privilege of being included, and how the giving never seemed to stop, and the inclusion never seemed to fully arrive. He set down his pen. He stood up slowly and buttoned his jacket. He looked around the room once, not with anger, just with the calm attention of a man making sure he saw everything clearly. "No," he said. The words sat in the air. Around the table, translators flickered, confirming that no nuance had been lost. The word was exactly what it appeared to be. Orvan's great head tilted slightly. "President Cole," it said, in measured tones, "I wonder if you have fully understood the—" "I understood everything," Cole said. "I have understood everything at every meeting for 40 years. I am done understanding. Humanity is withdrawing from this negotiation, effective now. Any vessel, Draknari, coalition or otherwise, that enters Kepler Belt space without the permission of an Earth authority will be treated as an act of war. We will respond accordingly." Daniel Harrow had gone the color of old paper. Laura Briggs had already pushed back her chair. Cole picked up his briefcase. He nodded to Harrow, who stood on shaking legs. The three of them walked toward the chamber's exit, their footsteps quiet on the smooth floor. Behind them, the room erupted. A dozen alien voices competed through translators, the clicking and thrumming and bubbling of species trying to process what had just happened. Orvan's voice cut through the others, still composed, but with an edge in it that was not quite amusement anymore. "President Cole," the consul said, "your fleet numbers 53 vessels. The Draknari Armada has not lost a campaign in 300 years. You have never fought a war beyond your own solar system. You are choosing to die." Cole stopped at the door. He did not turn around. He stood there for just a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was easy and level, like a man commenting on the weather. "Nobody thought much of us the last few hundred times either," he said. "They were wrong every time." He walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. In the corridor, Harrow pressed his back against the wall and took several careful breaths. Laura Briggs was already pulling up her communications unit, running through the list of calls that needed to happen in the next 20 minutes. Cole walked forward at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, hands in his pockets. "Sir," Harrow said, catching up, "I need to ask, do you have a plan?" Cole glanced at him sideways. There was something in his expression that was not quite a smile. "Laura has a plan," he said. "I just made sure she got to use it." Behind them, 300 years of Draknari undefeated history began, very quietly, to count down. When humanity's president declared, "Enough talking, let's start the war." Part 2. The news hit Earth at 3 in the morning. By 4, every major government building had its lights on. By 5, there were people in the streets, not rioting, not panicking, just standing in small groups in the cold air, looking up at the sky and talking in low voices, the way people do when they feel that something large has shifted under their feet. By 6, General Laura Briggs was standing in the Pentagon's deepest briefing room, in front of a holographic map of the Kepler Belt, with a cup of coffee she had not touched, and a room full of commanders who had not slept. The initial reports from the Coalition's intelligence networks had already reached Earth through back channels. The Draknari hegemony was mobilizing. 200 vessels were being repositioned toward the belt. The Qual probability models, which were considered among the most accurate in the known galaxy, had given humanity an 11% chance of meaningful resistance, and a near-certain prediction of full colonial surrender within 2 weeks. Laura Briggs looked at the probability models for approximately 4 seconds. Then she moved on. She turned to Admiral Pete Dawson, a big, quiet man from Georgia, who commanded Earth's small but carefully maintained deep space fleet. She asked him how long it would take to get their 3 newest cruisers fully operational and repositioned to the belt's outer edge without being detected by Draknari long-range sensors. Dawson thought about it. 6 weeks, if we run dark and use the debris corridors. "We have 5, she said. Figure it out. She turned next to Colonel Sam Wells, who ran Earth's Office of Unconventional Warfare from a building that did not officially exist. Sam Wells was a small, unhurried man who wore the same expression at a children's birthday party as he did in a war room. He had spent 3 years in the Kepler Belt on a classified assignment that had mostly involved listening and learning. Laura asked him what he knew about the colonial defense potential. What Sam Wells knew was considerable. He had spent his time in the belt not just gathering intelligence, but making friends with cargo haulers, mining foremen, colony engineers, and the kind of local leaders that official reports described as civilian administrators, but who were, in practice, the people who kept everything running when the systems failed. These were people who had built their homes in places that had no business being inhabited, using tools they had mostly modified themselves, solving problems that had no manual. He told Laura about Roy Carter, who ran a 6-ship freight operation out of Kepler 4 and had already, according to his last communication, started welding steel plating onto his lead vessel's hull because, in his words, he had figured this was coming. He told her about Diane Walsh on Colony 7, a former structural engineer. He had quietly been inventorying every piece of mining equipment on the moon for the past 2 months. He told her about the tunnels, hundreds of kilometers of pressurized shafts that ran through the interior of nearly every inhabited asteroid in the belt. Tunnels that did not appear on any coalition standard navigation chart because the colonists had dug them without filing the paperwork. Laura listened, and as she listened, the shape of something began to form in her mind. Not elegant, not traditional, but solid. Then Dr. Kate Morrison arrived. Kate was 44, small and precise, with the focused energy of someone who was always slightly ahead of the conversation. She ran the Ares Propulsion Laboratory, which was housed in a mountain in Nevada, and had a budget that did not appear in any public document. She set a data drive on the table and said without preamble, "I have been waiting 2 years for someone to authorize this." What Kate Morrison had been sitting on for 2 years was a complete working model of Drachnari fold drive mathematics. It had been derived from partial specifications that Earth had received as part of a coalition technology sharing agreement that was never meant to give humanity enough to actually understand. Earth had been given the edge of the map, and Kate's team had drawn the rest themselves. The practical meaning was significant. Human ships using Kate's drive modifications would enter and exit fold space with a completely different signature than any coalition vessel. Drachnari tracking systems, calibrated to detect standard coalition fold signatures, would not see them coming. After Kate finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Pete Dawson said slowly, "You have had this for 2 years." Kate said, "Nobody asked." A young engineer named Carl Briggs, no relation, as she mentioned once with a brief and dry expression, had developed a close-range point defense grid that had been tested in simulations against Drachnari plasma broadside fire, and had neutralized 93% of incoming rounds. The catch was that it only worked at close range, within 20 kilometers, which meant any ship using it would have to close the distance to what most conventional military thinking would describe as suicide range. Laura looked at the data, then at the map, then at the faces around the room. "We are not fighting their war," she said. "We are fighting ours." It was a simple statement, but every person in the room understood exactly what it meant. Every other species in the coalition fought by doctrine. Established formations, established ranges, established rules about when a situation was unwinnable. Those doctrines had been developed over centuries, and they worked, reliably, against enemies who followed the same logic. Humanity had never settled on a single doctrine. Its military history was a long and messy argument between 1,000 different approaches, and the one consistent thread running through all of them was that when the standard approach stopped working, human soldiers found another one. They adapted at a speed that had no equivalent anywhere in coalition warfare theory. They fought when they should have retreated, and retreated when they should have fought, and somehow, repeatedly, ended up somewhere that made no sense, until suddenly it did. In the Kepler belt, the colonists were already preparing without waiting for orders from anyone. Roy Carter had recruited 11 other freight captains. Diane Walsh had mapped every tunnel, every shaft, and every pressurized storage bay on her moon, and had stocked all of them with 3 months of supplies. A teenager on Colony 3 had written a targeting algorithm for the mining drones that his father described, with visible bafflement, as better than anything the military had produced. The Draknari's intelligence reports, arriving at the hegemony's high command around this same time, described Earth's preparations as desperate, but ultimately inadequate. The reports were not wrong about what they observed. They were only wrong about what it meant. Laura Briggs ended the briefing by looking at the room one last time. She did not give a speech. She said 4 sentences. They have been told their whole lives that we are small and manageable. We have let them believe that. We are going to keep letting them believe it for exactly as long as it takes to get our ships into position. After that, what they believe stops mattering. Nobody laughed. They all opened their notepads and started writing, which was the best possible response. 3 weeks later, the first supply ships left Earth for the belt, loaded with the things that a fleet officially too small to matter would need to fight a war it was not supposed to be able to win. In the Coalition's diplomatic halls, High Consul Orvan received a daily briefing on Earth's preparations, and reviewed each one with the considered patience of someone watching an insect build a wall against a flood. The briefings described factories running extra shifts, civilian ships being converted, universities turning out weapons engineers at rates that broke all peacetime records. Orvan read the briefings. It was not alarmed. It had seen desperate species before. It knew what happened to desperate species. What Orvan had never seen, what no alien intelligence document had ever fully captured in 40 years of watching humanity, was this. Human beings, when they decided something mattered, did not slow down. They sped up. They worked until their hands stopped working, and then they switched hands. They solved the same problem 6 different ways until one of the ways held. They argued loudly and continuously and without any apparent agreement, and then, when the moment came, they moved like one thing. Nobody in the Coalition had a model for that. Nobody had thought to build one. That, more than the ships, or the tunnels, or the full-drive mathematics, was the thing that was about to matter most. When humanity's president declared, "Enough talking, let's start the war." Part 3. The Draknari fleet arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody on Earth had planned it that way. It simply happened to be a Tuesday, a detail that was later noted by a Qua'al military historian, who found it statistically unremarkable, but which became something of a quiet joke among the human veterans who survived the war. Drathik the Unyielding commanded from the bridge of his flagship, a vessel 3 times the length of any ship Earth had ever built. He was a decorated warlord, the kind of commander whose career record held victories from 6 different campaigns across 3 spiral arms. He had crushed a species twice humanity's size in 18 days. He had done it not through brilliance, but through the application of overwhelming certainty, superior numbers, superior technology, and the deep institutional confidence of a military that had been winning wars for 3 centuries. He did not expect the Kepler belt to be different. His fleet dropped out of fold space in a standard crescent formation, 200 vessels in a sweeping arc, heavy cruisers anchoring the wings, destroyers filling the center, all of it tuned to the exact parameters of the Draknari Armada's standard contact protocol. He opened the broadcast on all known coalition frequencies, delivering the standard demand for immediate colonial surrender, and sat back to wait for the response that always came. Frightened voices, Requests for terms, the beginning of the end. For 6 minutes, nothing came back but static. Drathek's communications officer reported the silence. His tactical officer reported no visible defensive formation, no weapons lock, no energy signatures consistent with active warships. There was nothing in the debris field ahead except rock and ice, and the faint thermal readings of what appeared to be inactive mining equipment. Drathek decided to advance. 30 seconds later, the mining equipment turned on. Roy Carter had not slept in 31 hours. He was sitting in the converted bridge of his freight hauler, which had steel plating welded over its cargo bay windows, and a targeting system that Carl Briggs had transmitted remotely, and which Roy had installed himself with help from his mechanic, a woman named Sue Pratt, who had previously fixed mining drills and had adapted to the new work with the same practical attitude she brought to everything. Roy had 17 other captains on an open channel, former freight haulers, supply runners, and one woman named Gina Holt, who had operated an orbital survey vessel and brought a level of professionalism to the whole operation that Roy quietly appreciated. He looked at the Draknari formation on his screen. 200 warships. He looked at his own readouts. 12 converted freighters. 18 automated mining drones. Enough explosive material to cause a serious problem, and absolutely nothing else. He keyed the channel and said, calmly, "All right, like we talked about. 3, 2, 1, go." The mining drones went first, but not at the ships. They went at the debris field itself, detonating charges that had been set inside 36 large asteroids over the previous 2 weeks. The asteroids did not explode in a dramatic way. They fractured, sending tons of rock and ice moving outward in unpredictable directions across a 40,000-kilometer front. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was chaos. Carefully planned, patiently prepared chaos, designed to do one specific thing to a crescent formation: make it break. It broke. Draknari captains, trained to hold formation discipline under fire, suddenly had chunks of rock the size of houses moving at them from every direction. The crescent pulled apart as ships adjusted, creating gaps in some sectors and dangerous clustering in others. Drathek's orders to maintain formation competed with the immediate reality of collision avoidance, and the result was nearly 20 minutes of tactical confusion that Drathek would later describe in his after-action report as unexpected environmental interference, and which his subordinates described, more privately, as a disaster. Into the gaps came 3 ships that no Draknari tracking system had seen. Commodore Lena Park was 38 years old. She had spent 12 years as a deep space rescue pilot, which meant she had spent 12 years flying into the worst situation she could find, at the highest possible speed, with the intention of pulling people out alive. She had taken command of the cruiser group 6 weeks earlier, at Laura Briggs's specific request, because Laura had told her she needed someone who did not know how to wait. Lena's 3 cruisers came out of their fold points inside the debris corridor, using Kate Morrison's modified drive, registering as nothing on Draknari sensors until they were 22 kilometers from the nearest enemy vessel. At 22 kilometers, Carl Briggs's point defense grid came fully online. At 20 kilometers, Lena gave the order to engage. What followed was not a battle in any way that Drathek's War College had covered. He had been trained for long-range exchanges, for the slow attrition of broadside fire, for the tactical language of distance and formation. Lena Park did not speak that language. She flew the way she had always flown. Close, fast, improvised, reading the situation in real time and adjusting before the adjustment had a name. Her cruisers cut through the disordered Draknari formation at a range too close for the heavy guns to track properly. The point defense systems absorbed plasma fire as fast as it came. Her gunners targeted propulsion units, sensor arrays, and communications relays, not destroying the ships outright, but blinding them, disabling them, pulling them out of the fight, in ways that created more confusion than destruction would have. A dead ship is a known obstacle. A drifting, silent ship with no sensors and no communications is something else entirely. Roy Carter's 12 freight haulers came in on the flank. They were not warships. They were not pretending to be warships. They moved in loose clusters, firing converted mining lasers that were never designed to cut hull plating, but managed it well enough at close range. And Roy had gotten close enough by threading his ships through the same debris field his drones had created, moving through rocks in ways that no Draknari pilot tried to follow, because it looked, from the outside, completely insane. It was not insane. It was simply a different kind of mathematics. The kind that comes from a lifetime spent navigating tight spaces at speed, where the rule is not to avoid the obstacle, but to use it. After 40 minutes, Drathek ordered a withdrawal. He had lost 61 ships destroyed or disabled. His remaining fleet retreated beyond the belt's outer edge and held position. His after-action report, transmitted back to the Hegemony's High Command, described the engagement as a temporary setback caused by unconventional tactics and unexpected equipment capabilities. He requested reinforcements and expressed confidence that with proper numbers, the result would be different. His High Command agreed. They sent the reinforcements. They did not consider the possibility that more ships against the same opponents might simply produce the same result at larger scale. On the Conclave platform, High Consul Orvan received the battle report at the start of what should have been a routine morning session. It read through the report once in silence. Then it asked for the report to be read aloud, which was unusual for Orvan, who had perfect recall. Then it asked for the room to be cleared of everyone except its senior advisors, which was very unusual indeed. In the corridor outside, a young Quawel analyst who had prepared the original probability models pulled up his calculations on a datapad. He looked at them for a long time. He checked the inputs. He checked the methodology. Everything was correct. The model was functioning exactly as designed. Then he opened a new document and began, very quietly, running different numbers, because the model had been designed with a specific assumption built into its foundation. And the assumption was that under pressure, any species would begin to degrade. Slower decisions, more errors, increasing panic, the gradual collapse of coherent action. Every species in the Coalition's recorded history had behaved this way. The degradation curve was one of the most reliable constants in Coalition military science. He pulled up the engagement data from the Kepler belt. He ran the timeline. He looked at the decisions that Roy Carter's fleet had made in the final 10 minutes of the battle, when they had been outnumbered 6-1, and should, by every model he had, been in the first phase of collapse. They had been, if anything, more creative in those 10 minutes than in the first 30. He sat with that for a while. Then he wrote a note to himself in a private file. The baseline assumption needs to be reviewed. He did not send the note to anyone. He was not yet sure what it meant. He would understand it more clearly in the months ahead. When humanity's president declared, "Enough talking, let's start the war." Part 4. The war expanded the way fire expands in an oxygen-rich environment, faster than expected, and in directions that no one had fully predicted. The Draknari hegemony, stung by what its leadership publicly called a tactical irregularity, and privately called an embarrassment, committed 1,200 vessels to the Kepler Belt campaign. It was not their full armada, but it was enough to make the intent unmistakably clear. This would be resolved, cleanly and finally, within weeks. The Hegemony's High Command looked at Earth's fleet numbers and calculated the outcome the same way they always had, by the weight of metal and the number of guns. They did not calculate for what was happening inside the belt. Colonel Sam Wells had arrived on Kepler 4 with a team of 32 specialists and a set of plans that looked, to anyone reading them cold, less like a military strategy and more like an extremely detailed list of ways to cause problems. He linked up with Diane Walsh on Colony 7, 3 days after landing. Diane met him in a tunnel 200 meters below the moon's surface, wearing a mining suit and holding a data pad covered in hand-drawn notes, and briefed him on the colonial defense situation with the calm efficiency of someone who had been running large engineering projects her entire life, and had simply decided that this was the same kind of work, with different materials. Sam listened to her full briefing, and then told her honestly that she had already done more than he had expected to find. She said that was nice to hear, but could he get her 6 more plasma cutters, because she had found a second tunnel network the previous week, and it needed to be secured. He said he would try. She said she needed them in 4 days. He said he would definitely try. He got them in 3. Over the following weeks, Sam's team and the colonial militias built something that did not have a proper military name. It was part fortress, part trap, part community project. Every mining shaft was mapped and given a purpose. Some became supply routes, some became fighting positions. Some became dead ends packed with materials that would react very badly to weapons fire if the enemy came through not knowing what was stored there. The colonists knew their terrain the way soldiers almost never know terrain. They had lived in it, built it, repaired it at 2 in the morning when the pressure seals failed. They moved through it in ways that Draknari ground troops simply could not match. When the Draknari landed forces on 3 of the Belt's moons, they found that taking a position was one problem, and holding it was something else entirely. The colonial fighters did not stand in the open and exchange fire. They came from tunnels. They came at night cycles, when Draknari external sensors were calibrated to a different light frequency. They came from directions that the tactical maps marked as solid rock. They disrupted supply lines, disabled landing platforms, and then retreated into a network that absorbed them completely. Draknari commanders sent increasingly frustrated dispatches home. The humans, the dispatches reported, did not behave like a defeated enemy. They did not degrade according to any known model. Captured soldiers were sometimes recovered days later, having escaped from holding facilities by methods that the security teams were still trying to reconstruct. Units under sustained orbital bombardment continued operating from deeper in the tunnels, organized, communicating, and planning. One colonial group had spent 3 days under nearly continuous fire, and had responded by setting up a secondary defense line 50 meters deeper, restocking their supplies, and sending Sam Wells a communication that was mostly an inventory update, with a note at the bottom asking whether the plasma cutters could become a regular delivery schedule. Meanwhile, something was changing in the coalition that had nothing to do with ships or tunnels or weapons. President Aaron Cole gave his broadcast on a Wednesday evening, transmitted from a simple room in the White House with no staging, no ceremony, and no speechwriter's polished language. He sat at a plain desk and spoke for 11 minutes. He talked about the colonists, not in terms of territory or sovereignty or strategic interest, but by name. He talked about Roy Carter and his fleet of converted freighters. He talked about Diane Walsh and the tunnels she had built to protect her community. He talked about a 9-year-old girl named Mia on Kepler 7, whose mother had written him a letter, and who was currently doing her schoolwork in an underground shelter because the classroom above had been converted into a supply depot. He said in plain and simple words that humanity was not fighting because it had been offended. It was not fighting for pride or politics or any claim of historical right. It was fighting because 4 million people had been told they were protected, and he intended to keep that promise, and he would keep it with every resource Earth possessed for as long as it took. He did not say a word about glory. He did not talk about destiny. He talked about people. The broadcast was reviewed by Vreth cultural scholars, who issued a formal analysis describing it as emotionally simplistic and tactically irrelevant. That same broadcast was watched in full by 31 million VREF civilians across 4 separate systems. The Cultural Scholars Report did not mention that number. High Consul Orvan requested a private communication channel to President Cole 8 days after the broadcast. The request came through an unofficial back channel, which told Cole more than the request itself did. He took the call in a small room with just Laura Briggs present, and he listened to 20 minutes of very carefully worded diplomatic language that amounted, beneath all the careful language, to a single question. What would it take for this to end without destroying everything? Cole listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, "Are you in, or are you watching?" There was a long pause. Orvan said that the coalition's position was nuanced and required further internal review. Cole said, "Nuanced does not help me get Mia back to her classroom." Then Orvan said that the VREF were considering a formal reassessment of their current support commitments. Cole said, "I will take that. You have 2 weeks." After the call ended, Laura Briggs asked him whether he thought Orvan would actually come through. Cole said he did not know. Then he said that it did not change anything either way, because the plan did not depend on the coalition's help. It only got easier with it. He was right on both counts. In the conclave, a young VREF delegate named Sorvan had spent the past month doing something unusual for a junior member of any species' diplomatic staff. He had been asking questions and then genuinely listening to the answers. He had read everything available about human military history, not the summaries and coalition briefing packages, but the original records, the detailed ones, the ones that ran through centuries of conflict. He had requested access to the Qua'al probability models, and upon reading them carefully, had asked the authors a question they found difficult. Had the models accounted for the possibility that human behavior under extreme pressure did not follow the standard degradation curve? The model's authors said the models accounted for all known variables, as they always had. Sorvan said, "I think that might be the problem." He stood up in a closed council session and asked, clearly and without apology, what exactly would happen to the rest of the coalition if humanity lost, and the Draknari looked across the border at the remaining members. Members who had just watched a species fight back alone, rather than abandon its people, and who had responded by calling it emotionally simplistic. The room was quiet for a long time. Nobody told him he was wrong. Kate Morrison's full drive modifications had been installed across every human warship now in the field, which meant that Earth's small fleet was moving through space in ways the Draknari could not predict or track reliably. Admiral Pete Dawson had added 8 more vessels to Lena Park's group, including 2 heavy cruisers that had been in final construction when the war started, and which Earth had finished ahead of schedule by running the shipyard in shifts around the clock. The workers on those ships had not been ordered to work the extra hours. They had simply stayed. The Draknari's 1,200 vessels were large, powerful, and organized. They were also increasingly stretched, trying to hold multiple moons against a ground campaign that operated by no known rules, trying to interdict a human fleet that arrived from unexpected directions and fought at ranges their standard doctrine had no answer for, and trying to make sense of intelligence reports that described an enemy who seemed to become more effective, not less, as the weeks passed. In a private communication to the Hegemony's ruling council, one of Drathek's senior officers wrote something that was later recovered and became somewhat famous. These beings do not appear to have a ceiling on their willingness to continue. We have been applying pressure for 7 weeks. Standard models predict collapse at week 4. There is no collapse. There is only adjustment. The ruling council read the communication and ordered more pressure. They did not consider what comes after the ceiling is gone. When humanity's president declared, "Enough talking, let's start the war." H2, Part 5. The final campaign began on a morning that felt on Earth like any other morning. Coffee brewing, news feeds running, children heading to school. The war had been going on for 4 months, and people had adapted to it the way people adapt to things that are serious but not immediately visible from their windows. They followed the dispatches. They sent supply packages to the belt. They argued about it at dinner tables and worried about it privately and went to work anyway, because that was what people did. In the Kepler belt, things were less routine. Roy Carter had not had a full night of sleep since the war began, and he had stopped tracking the numbers somewhere in the 3rd month. He had 11 ships now. One had been destroyed in a skirmish near Kepler 11, a loss that sat in the chest of everyone in the fleet like a stone that would not move. And 4 new captains had arrived from 3 different systems after news of the first battle had spread. He had been referred to as Admiral Carter in official communications for the past 6 weeks, a title that no one with formal authority had assigned to him, and which had simply propagated through the network because no better option had presented itself. He kept meaning to send a message asking about this. He had not gotten around to it. Commodore Lena Park had spent 4 months running her cruiser group through engagements that the Draknari kept expecting to follow a recognizable pattern, and which kept failing to do so. She had lost 1 cruiser in the 3rd month, not in battle, but to a mechanical failure during a rapid repositioning maneuver. The ship was gone, and the people who had served on it felt the absence every single day. Lena had kept moving. That was what you did. Earth had sent additional vessels in the 2nd and 3rd months, and the combined force that the Qua'al probability models had written off as tactically insignificant had become something that Draknari analysts were now allocating full teams to understanding. They were not making satisfactory progress, because what they were trying to understand was not a doctrine or a system. It was a way of being in a fight. 3 coalition species committed fleet assets at the start of the 4th month. The Vreth were first, which surprised most observers, but not Sorvan, who had been quietly and persistently making the same argument to Orvan for weeks. 2 smaller species followed within days. None of them were contributing out of idealism, and nobody was pretending they were. They had done their own calculations, and concluded, as Sorvan had argued to the Council, that a Draknari victory would not end at Earth's borders. They were in for their own reasons. That was fine. Being in was what mattered. The coalition commanders who arrived at the joint briefing were experienced, professional, and genuinely prepared to be useful. They were not entirely prepared for what a planning session with Lena Park and Roy Carter and Sam Wells actually looked like in practice. Roy sat at the back of the room and drew on a physical notepad, which no one else had used in a military context in several decades. Sam Wells spoke without notes, answered questions with other questions, and had a way of restructuring the entire conversation without appearing to redirect it. Lena laid out the final plan in 22 minutes, opened the floor for input, and incorporated every useful suggestion from the coalition officers in real time, in ways that the lead Vreth tactical commander later described as unusually fluid, and which his aide described, more accurately, as she had already accounted for most of it, and simply let us believe we contributed. The plan had 17 variables and 11 contingency branches. Sam Wells had added a final section titled, "When Things Go Sideways," which was longer than the main plan, and contained specific instructions for 12 ways things were likely to go wrong, and exactly what to do about each one. The coalition commanders read the section carefully. None of them asked for it to be removed. The Draknari armada, reduced to roughly 800 vessels after 4 months of attrition, held position beyond the belt's edge. Drathek the Unyielding had received the intelligence reports about coalition involvement, and had adjusted his thinking accordingly. He knew now that he had underestimated the humans. He did not intend to underestimate the combined force that faced him. He arrayed his armada carefully, with strong center lines and reinforced flanks, and waited for the slow and formal approach that coalition fleets always made when they committed to a major engagement. He waited through 9 days of repositioning and resupply. Then the 9th day ended, and what came next was not slow, and it was not formal. Lena Park's cruisers went first, moving through a debris corridor that the Armada's scouts had logged as unnavigable, and had therefore stopped monitoring. Roy Carter's fleet came from the outer belt edge, not shooting initially, just moving in patterns that pulled Draknari defensive attention outward, stretching the formation toward the belt's perimeter. Sam Wells coordinated 3 simultaneous actions on the inhabited moons. None of them were designed to achieve anything militarily significant, but all of them generated enough communications traffic to require the Draknari Ground Command's full attention for approximately 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, the coalition fleet hit the Armada's center from an angle that Drathik's formation had left thin while repositioning, and the engagement that followed was much shorter than anyone on either side had expected. Lena drove her group straight through the center before the formation could close again. The Vreth battlecruisers, following Lena's updated positioning in real time rather than the pre-approved approach vectors, came in behind and expanded the breach. Roy Carter brought his fleet around from the outer edge at the same moment, and what had been a controlled defensive formation became 3 separate clusters, trying to respond to 4 simultaneous problems. Drathik called for a parley when his command ship was boxed between Lena's cruisers and 2 Vreth battlecruisers on the other side. The request was formal and correct, and came through on all fleet channels exactly according to coalition protocol. Lena Park's response was transmitted across the entire combined fleet. She said, "You had your talking. Come out with your hands, or whatever you have got, up." 3 of the Vreth commanders reported afterward that they had needed a moment to process the full weight of the statement. The 2 smaller species commanders said they had understood it immediately. Roy Carter was captured on the open channel, making a sound that was clearly a laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from 4 months of not sleeping enough and carrying something heavy, and it was the best sound anyone on the channel had heard in a long time. The Armada stood down over 6 hours. There were individual Draknari captains who did not comply, and had to be persuaded by the specific and efficient attention of forces that were tired enough and practiced enough to handle it quickly. But by evening, a Tuesday evening, for those who noted these things, the last Draknari vessel had powered its weapons down, and the Kepler belt was quiet for the first time in 4 months. The formal signing took place on Earth on a clear afternoon in November, on the steps of the rebuilt United Nations building. President Aaron Cole sat across from the hegemony's senior diplomatic representative and signed the documents that ended the war. He was flanked by General Laura Briggs, who was doing the same quiet calculations in her head that she always did, and Ambassador Daniel Harrow, who had aged visibly over 4 months and appeared to be at peace with every year of it. The Galactic Conclave convened a full formal session the following week. High Consul Orvon delivered the address recognizing humanity's new standing in the coalition. Full member, no qualifications, no conditions, no further review. The address was careful and diplomatic and took 35 minutes. Cole listened without interrupting. Then he thanked the coalition for their support and said with the same easy directness he had used in that chamber 4 months earlier, that Earth expected its allies to help rebuild the Kepler belt, as a statement of reasonable expectation between partners. Afterward, in a small side room off the main chamber, Sorvon found Cole pouring himself coffee from a battered thermos that he had apparently brought from Washington in his travel bag. Sorvon stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped in. He asked whether humanity had always been capable of what it had done in the past 4 months, or whether something had changed, whether the war itself had made humanity into something it had not been before. Cole thought about it for a real moment. He thought about Roy Carter, still flying his converted freight hauler with steel plates welded over the windows because he had not gotten around to removing them. He thought about Diane Walsh, who had sent him a letter 3 days ago with preliminary drawings for Colony 7's rebuilt school, noting that the school was the first priority and that construction would begin the same week the repair crews arrived. He thought about Mia, who was 9 years old and who was, as of 3 days ago, back in her classroom. "No," Cole said, "we have always been like this. You just never paid enough attention to notice." He held out a cup. Sorvon looked at it for a moment, at the simple ceramic mug, the dark liquid, the entirely ordinary gesture, and then accepted it. Outside, on the plaza below, the first transport ships from the Kepler belt were coming into land. The colonists came down the ramps in groups and stood in the November air, not quite ready to fully believe in the ground under their feet yet, looking up at a sky they had not seen in months. Some of them were crying, most of them were not. They were just standing there, taking it in, breathing air that was cold and clean and real. Nobody organized a ceremony for them. Nobody made a speech. The moment did not need one. They had come home. After everything, they had come home.